Gunnison Basin, Colorado, August 1882. The sun was a hammer in the thin, high-altitude air. Below the jagged line of the Elk Mountains, the valley floor was a sweep of sage and dry grass, punctuated by the raw timber frames of a fledgling settlement. And in the side of a low, granite-stubbled hill, a man was digging, not for silver, not for gold, but for a home. Jowan Trevithick moved with the steady economy of motion that spoke of a life spent working stone. He wasn't using dynamite or heavy drills. He was using a pick, a shovel, and an iron pry bar, clearing dirt and loose rock from a natural bowl-shaped depression in the hillside. It was perhaps 40 feet across and 10 feet deep, a shallow scoop in the earth's flank. From the trail above, two men watched. Hale Bruckner, the freight hauler whose wagons were the town's lifeline, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Still at it," he said, his voice a low rumble of disapproval. "Digging his own grave, if you ask me." His companion, a farmer named Silas Croft, shook his head. "It's the damnedest thing I've ever seen. A man with a wife and 2 young ones, and he's planning to live in a hole in the ground. It's not decent." Bruckner squinted, his gaze fixed on the growing pile of excavated rock. "He calls it a basin. Says the granite will hold the heat. I call it a mud trap. First big melt, that thing's going to fill like a bucket." He asked me about hauling 12-inch roof beams up from the railhead. I told him I wouldn't do it. My mules, my wagon, my time. I'm not wasting them on a fool's errand. A man wants to build a proper cabin, I'll haul his timber. I won't be party to drowning a family. The word spread through the small cluster of cabins. The Cornishman, the quiet quarryman who'd arrived the previous fall, was building something foolish, something mad. He was making a home where a coyote might make a den. The children whispered about it. The men mocked it over lukewarm beer at the end of the day. They called it Trevithick's Folly. He heard the talk, saw the looks, but said nothing. He just kept digging. What did this Cornish quarryman, a man who understood the deep, slow pressures of the earth, understand about the physics of convection that the experienced frontiersmen, masters of the log cabin, had missed entirely? I'm going to tell you the story of Jowan Trevithick, and I promise that by the end of it, you will understand the invisible enemy that defeated so many settlers. You'll learn how a simple understanding of moving air could mean the difference between life and death. If you find this kind of practical, historical knowledge valuable, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what you think the biggest challenge of frontier building was. Jowan Trevithick was not a carpenter. He was not a farmer, nor was he a frontiersman in the way the Gunnison Valley understood the term. He was a man of granite, slate, and serpentine. Born in Cornwall, he had spent 20 years of his life in the Delabole Quarry, one of the oldest and deepest pits in England. His hands understood the language of stone, how to read its grain, where to place a wedge, how to split a 1,000-ton block with a patient series of taps. He understood that stone was not just a dead thing, it was a vessel. In Cornwall, he had carved cisterns, troughs, and stable bowls, heavy, immutable shapes that held water and blocked the ceaseless Atlantic wind. He thought in terms of mass, stability, and shelter. He had brought his wife Alara and their 2 children, Morwen and Paran, to Colorado for the promise of land and air that didn't taste of coal dust. But their first winter, in a hastily built, conventional log cabin, had been a lesson in a new kind of misery. It was a misery of 1,000 tiny failures. Jowan had built their cabin just as his neighbors had, chinking the logs with a mixture of mud and grass. It looked solid. It felt sturdy. But the Gunnison wind, a relentless, scouring force born on the high peaks, treated it like a sieve. The cold was an occupying army. It found every pinhole gap in the chinking. It slid under the door and around the window frames. Ilara's cups of tea, left on the table overnight, would have a skin of ice by dawn. The cabin's single door, made of rough sawn pine, would shrink in the dry cold, and the wind would rattle it in its frame so violently that Piran would wake up crying, convinced a beast was trying to get in. Jowan would rise in the dark, stuffing rags into the gaps, a futile gesture against an invisible flood. The flour sacks in the corner grew stiff, the flour inside cold and hard-packed. They burned through their woodpile at a terrifying rate, the big iron stove glowing red-hot, yet the heat seemed to vanish as soon as it left the metal. The family lived in a small bubble of warmth 6 feet around the stove, while the corners of the single room remained arctic. That winter, Jowan didn't just feel the cold. He studied it. He watched the way the flame of a candle would gutter and dance, even with the door and window shut, revealing the unseen currents of air slicing through his home. The problem wasn't the logs. The problem was the air. His neighbors suffered the same fate, only they considered it normal. They built bigger fires. They wore more layers indoors. The family of Eli Vance, whose cabin was more exposed on a small rise, went through 12 cords of wood that winter. They were constantly chopping, hauling, and feeding the stove. Their cabin was a study in extremes: scorching heat near the fire, freezing temperatures near the walls. The condensation from their breath and cooking would freeze solid on the interior of the north-facing wall, a glittering, beautiful, and deadly layer of frost that proved just how much heat was being lost. These cabins were failing because of a principle Jowan understood from his work in the quarry: convection. In the simplest terms, heat moves in 3 ways: conduction, through direct contact; radiation, through electromagnetic waves, like the sun's warmth; and convection, through the movement of fluids, like air or water. On the high plains of Colorado, convection was king, and its agent was the wind. A log wall, even a thick one, has an R value, a measure of thermal resistance, of about 1.4 per inch. A 12-inch log wall, then, has an R value of around 16. That's not bad, but it's only half the story. The real enemy was air infiltration. Moving air is a thief. A 30-mile-per-hour wind on a 0-degree day doesn't make the air itself colder, but it strips heat from a surface exponentially faster than still air. This is the wind chill effect. Every tiny crack in the chinking, every gap around the door jamb, became a superhighway for heat to escape. The warm, light air inside the cabin would be sucked out, replaced by cold, dense air pouring in. The settlers were trying to heat the entire Gunnison Basin, one stove full at a time. It was a battle they could never win. Jowan knew he couldn't defeat the wind. It was a force of nature, as powerful and indifferent as the granite he used to quarry. But he didn't have to defeat it. He just had to get out of its way. That spring, as the snow melted and the ground softened, he walked the small parcel of land he owned not as a farmer looking for fertile soil, but as a quarryman looking for a stable bowl. And he found it, a natural granite depression on the leeward side of a hill, sheltered from the prevailing northwesterly gales. This, he decided, would be his wall. The earth itself. The work began in July. The mockery started in August. First, he meticulously cleared the basin of all loose dirt and fractured stone, shoveling it into a wheelbarrow and dumping it nearby. He wasn't just clearing a space. He was shaping it, squaring the corners, creating a level floor about 35 feet long and 20 feet wide. The exposed granite walls of the basin were solid, part of the hill's bedrock. He would not have to build 3 of his walls. Nature had already provided them. For his 4th wall, the one facing southeast, he used the very stones he had excavated. He was no master mason, but he knew how to choose flat, stable rocks. He dry stacked them, fitting them together with patient precision, filling the gaps with a thick, sticky clay he found at the bottom of the basin. This front wall rose from the ground until its top was level with the natural rim of the rock bowl. He left openings for a single door and 2 small windows. Then came the most critical part of the design, and the part that earned him the most ridicule. On the windward side of the basin, the northwest side, he dug a trench. It was about 8 feet deep and 5 feet wide, running parallel to the back wall of his home, but separated from it by about 6 feet of solid earth. To his neighbors, it looked like a defensive moat, another layer of his madness. "What's that for, Jowan?" Silas Croft had called down one afternoon. "Keeping the buffalo out?" Jowan paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a dusty hand. "For the wind," he said, and that was all. He returned to his digging. The trench was a deceptively simple piece of fluid dynamics. Any wind cresting the hill would not slam down into his sunken roof. Instead, the air current would be forced to jump the trench, its energy dissipating. The trench created a pocket of dead, still air that would insulate the entire back of his structure. The roof was the biggest challenge, made more difficult by Hale Bruckner's refusal to help. 12-inch beams were out of the question. Jowan had to adapt. He spent 2 weeks harvesting smaller lodgepole pines from a stand half a mile away, felling them himself and dragging them back with a borrowed mule. He laid these smaller 6-inch logs across the structure, packing them tightly together. Over this, he layered thick sheets of aspen bark, overlapping them like shingles. Then came the final, crucial layer. He hauled load after load of the sod he had carefully saved when clearing the site. He packed it a foot deep across the entire roof, encouraging the native grasses to reroot. When he was finished, his home had all but vanished. It was merely a slight grass-covered swelling on the hillside, with a single stone wall, a door, and 2 windows looking out over the valley. The top of his roof was flush with the surrounding slope. A man could walk right over it and never know a family lived beneath his feet. Alara had watched the construction with a quiet trust that bordered on miraculous. "It's a strange-looking house, Jowan," she'd said one evening, her Cornish lilt softening the words. "But it feels quiet." "Quiet is warm," he'd replied. Hale Bruckner saw it differently. He rode by the day they were moving their meager furniture in. "Got your boat built for when the flood comes, Trevithick?" he'd yelled, gesturing at the sunken structure. "Because that hole is going to be a lake come spring thaw." Jowan simply looked up from the wooden chest he was carrying and said, "The ground is graded, Mr. Bruckner. Water runs downhill." He had, of course, ensured the floor of the basin and the ground around his front wall sloped gently away from the structure. It was a simple precaution, but one his critics, blinded by the novelty of the design, failed to see. To understand why Jowan's dugout was so revolutionary, we need to look closer at the physics of heat loss. A conventional cabin, standing exposed to the elements, is fighting a forefront war against the cold. Its walls and roof are constantly battered by wind, which, as we've discussed, is a brutally efficient thief of heat through forced convection. A standard cabin might lose 70% of its heat this way. Jowan's design fundamentally changed the battlefield. By sinking the house into the earth, he eliminated 3 of those fronts entirely. The ground is a massive thermal battery. Below the frost line, its temperature remains relatively constant, around 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. His back and side walls weren't exposed to a 0-degree wind. They were pressed against 50-degree earth. The heat loss through conduction into the soil was vastly, immeasurably slower than the heat loss through convection into the air. The sod roof was the second piece of the puzzle. A foot of dense soil and root insulation has an R value of around R20 to R25, significantly better than the log roof of a standard cabin. But more importantly, its aerodynamic profile meant the wind's power was nullified. The air flowed smoothly over the gentle slope, never gaining purchase, never creating the swirling vortices that suck heat from a building. The leeward trench acted as an insurance policy, a buffer of still air that protected the most vulnerable junction where the roof met the back wall. Finally, the single, exposed front wall faced southeast. This was a deliberate choice. It minimized exposure to the punishing northwesterly winter winds and maximized exposure to the morning sun. The two windows were small, limiting the area of glass, a notoriously poor insulator. The result was a structure that wasn't just a shelter, it was a thermal system, working in harmony with the landscape instead of defiance of it. Where a neighbor's stove had to generate enough BTUs to constantly fight the heat being ripped away by the wind, Jowan's stove only had to raise the temperature of the still, trapped air inside his home, from the baseline provided by the earth. The energy requirement was a fraction of the norm. He was no longer trying to heat the valley. He was simply warming a single, sealed, stone and earth bottle. The autumn of 1882 was mild, lulling the settlers into a false sense of security. Jowan laid in 4 cords of wood, a third of what Eli Vance had stockpiled. The mockery softened into a kind of pitying curiosity. The Trevithick family settled into their strange, quiet home. The first snows came in late November, blanketing the dugout until it was little more than a white hummock on the hill. The true test began in January. A Chinook wind swept down from the mountains. For 2 days, the temperature soared to an unseasonable 45 degrees. The snowpack melted, sending rivers of slush down the hillsides. Hale Bruckner rode past Jowan's dugout and felt a grim satisfaction as he saw a stream of meltwater running past the front of the house, exactly where a pond should be forming. He was sure the place was flooding. Then the Chinook crashed. The temperature didn't just drop, it fell off a cliff. In 6 hours, it went from 45 degrees above zero to 10 below, and the wind returned with demonic force. It was a full-blown gale, a steady 50-mile-per-hour roar from the northwest, with gusts hitting 70. The meltwater flash froze, encasing the entire valley in a sheath of treacherous ice. The wind picked up the new-fallen snow and turned it into a horizontal blizzard, a blinding, scouring torrent of ice particles. For the settlers in their log cabins, it was a 48-hour siege. At the Vance homestead, the wind found a loose corner of their shake roof and began peeling it back, one shingle at a time, with a sound like pistol shots. Eli and his oldest son spent a terrifying night on the roof in the heart of the storm, trying to nail it back down. Silas Croft's chimney, poorly mortared, began to leak smoke back into his cabin as the wind created a downdraft. They had to douse their fire, huddling together in the dark under a mountain of blankets, listening to the cabin timbers groan under the strain. The noise was constant, a physical assault that frayed nerves and made sleep impossible. Every wall seemed to breathe the Arctic air. Inside Jowan Trevithick's dugout, the world was different. The sound of the gale was not a roar, but a distant, muffled hum, like a faraway waterfall. There were no rattles, no groans, no drafts. The air was still, so still. The flame of their single oil lamp on the central table burned with a perfect, unwavering steadiness. It did not flicker. It did not dance. It was a tiny, placid sun in a universe of calm. Elara sat near it, mending a tear in Piran's shirt, threading her needle with ease on the first try. The children were asleep in their beds, buried under quilts, breathing the cool but not frigid air. The stove required only a single log every few hours, its gentle, radiant heat warming the stone walls, which in turn held that warmth and released it slowly. The temperature inside was a stable 60 degrees. The numerical contrast was stark. Outside, a wind chill of 50 below zero. Inside, a livable, quiet warmth, maintained with a fraction of the fuel. The image contrast was even starker. Eli Vance fighting for his roof in a blinding gale versus Jowan Trevithick calmly pulling a thread through a small piece of cloth. Hale Bruckner was caught out in the storm. He'd been trying to secure the canvas covers on his freight wagons, parked in a makeshift yard at the edge of town. The wind was a solid wall, tearing at him, stealing his breath. A gust, stronger than the rest, ripped the heavy canvas tarp from one of the wagons. It billowed up like a monstrous sail and went cartwheeling across the ice-crusted ground. It was a new tarp, and expensive. Cursing, Bruckner gave chase. He ran, slipping and sliding, his face numb, his eyes watering in the blast. The tarp snagged on a juniper bush near the hill where the Cornishman had built his folly. As Bruckner lunged for it, his feet shot out from under him on a patch of glare ice. He fell backward, tumbling down the short, steep slope, and landed with a painful thud in Jowan Trevithick's wind trench. He lay there for a moment, the wind knocked out of him, expecting the trench to be a vortex of freezing air, even worse than the exposed plain. He braced himself for the cold, but it didn't come. He pushed himself up onto his elbows and was struck by a profound and baffling sensation. Stillness. The roaring of the wind in his ears had ceased. The air around him was perfectly, utterly calm. He could feel the fine, granular snow settling gently on his shoulders, not blasting him horizontally. He looked up. Above the lip of the trench, not 6 feet over his head, he could see the blizzard raging past, a ghostly white river moving at impossible speed. But down here, in the narrow channel Jowan had dug, there was no wind. None. He got to his feet, shaken. He was standing on the windward side of the dugout. Logic dictated this should be the coldest, most brutal spot on the entire property. He reached out a bare hand, expecting the stone of the buried wall to be painfully cold. He pressed his palm against it. It was not. It was cool, yes, but it felt neutral, almost warm. It was radiating a faint, deep heat from within. He stood there, dumbfounded, a big, practical man confronted with a physical reality that defied everything he knew. In the heart of a life-threatening blizzard, he had stumbled into a pocket of absolute tranquility. He scrambled out of the trench and worked his way around to the front of the dugout. Through one of the small windows, he saw it. The lamp. The steady, unwavering flame. He had seen lamps in his own cabin and every other cabin in this storm flicker and smoke as drafts found their way in. But the Trevithick's lamp burned as if it were a calm summer evening. That tiny, stable point of light was the final, irrefutable proof. He didn't knock. He was too proud, too stunned. He simply turned and walked back to his wagons. The lost tarp, forgotten. He walked through the screaming wind, but his mind was in the stillness of that trench. The mockery had been hollow. The certainty had been ignorance. The quarryman had been right. As he reached his wagon, Bruckner paused and looked back at the nearly invisible bump on the hillside. He spoke the words aloud to the storm, a confession and a revelation. "You didn't build a house," he murmured, his voice full of a new and unfamiliar awe. "You carved a piece of the calm." The next day, after the storm had blown itself out, Bruckner loaded 2 of the finest, straightest 12-inch timbers he had onto his wagon and drove them up to Jowan's dugout. He said nothing of the night before. He just looked at Jowan and said, "I was wrong to refuse the haul. You should have these, to reinforce the roof." Jowan looked at the massive beams, then at the freight hauler. He nodded slowly. "Thank you, Mr. Bruckner. They will be a great help." The knowledge was shared without gloating. The apology was delivered without words. Respect had been earned. That was the beginning of the change. Hale Bruckner, the loudest critic, became the most powerful advocate. His work took him all over the region, to mining camps, ranches, and isolated way stations. And everywhere he went, he told the story of the Cornishman's dugout. He didn't talk about physics. He talked about the still air in the trench, the lamp that did not flicker. He was a freight hauler, a man who dealt in practicalities. And this was the most practical thing he had ever seen. The first to adopt the idea were other freight crews. They were responsible for maintaining the small, crude line shacks and way stations along the freight routes. These were notoriously cold, drafty buildings. That spring, following Bruckner's detailed instructions, a crew on the route to Montrose dug a deep trench along the windward side of their main way station. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The station, which had once consumed a rick of wood a week, now stayed tolerable with half that amount. By 1884, a dozen way stations and line shacks in the Gunnison country featured a Trevithick trench. It became a standard common-sense modification. A few brave homesteaders, building new, even tried full dugouts, finding their own hillside bowls. The idea spread not through newspapers or books, but through word of mouth, carried by practical men who saw a thing that worked. Jowan Trevithick's innovation was an intuitive discovery of principles that modern building science would not formalize for another century. His earth-sheltered design created a super-insulated, airtight building envelope. His use of the trench to create a dead-air space was a masterful piece of passive environmental control. He was practicing sustainable, high-performance design before any of those terms existed. He did it not to be revolutionary, but to keep his family warm. There is a profound lesson in Jowan's solution. The other settlers saw the Gunnison landscape as an adversary. They built structures that stood up against the wind, opposing it, fighting it. Their cabins were declarations of defiance. And so they were constantly under siege, constantly losing the war for warmth. Jowan, the man of stone, saw the landscape differently. He did not see an enemy. He saw a tool. He understood that the very thing that gave the wind its power, the shape of the land, could also be used to rob it of that power. He didn't build against the hill. He built with it. He found the answer not in adding more wood or a bigger stove, but in subtracting the force that was causing the problem. He let the earth do the work. He saw what the others missed. The ground that stops the wind becomes the wall. Thank you for joining us for this story. If you'd like to see more tales of frontier ingenuity, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. And let us know in the comments, have you ever seen an old building with a clever design feature like Jowan's trench? Disclaimer: this video presents a historically inspired reconstruction for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. The application of any building techniques today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and professional consultation. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.